Have you ever thought about the flaws in your cutting board or wanting to get a new one? Picture this, a beautiful, sturdy cutting board that you made yourself. Think about how often you use your cutting board, whether it's for chopping vegetables, slicing meats, or just preparing meals. I'm sure most of you use one in your cooking demonstration. Now imagine you used one that you made with your own two hands. I've been woodworking since I was 8 years old, and a cutting board is one of the easiest little projects you can make. Not only does it make for a great gift, but also a unique addition to your kitchen. Now I'll walk you through the steps of making a cutting board, from choosing the wood, cutting and sanding, and finally finishing with oil and waxing. So now I'll talk about the tools you'll need for the gluing process. First, you'll need bar clamps. I'll be using 2 for my size of the cutting board. Next, you'll need your spring clamps, food-safe wood glue, a clean paintbrush, and a pencil. Now that we've talked about the tools you'll need for this process, now we'll get into arranging the wood. First, I picked maple because it's a light colored wood, and walnut because it's a dark colored wood. I think these two wood species contrast each other very nicely. I arranged them side by side, alternating colors, because I think this is the most aesthetically pleasing, but you can arrange it however you'd like. Next, we'll take the pencil and we'll draw 3 lines curved on the surface of the wood. This is for when you're gluing. You can make sure that the lines line up and you make sure that you have all the pieces in the right place. Now that we've drawn our lines and arranged the wood how we'd like, we'll get on to the gluing. First, you'll flip each edge towards you. You can leave the last one down since it'll get glue on it anyway. Next, you'll take your food-safe wood glue and glue strips onto each edge. Next, you'll put all your woods together and you'll brush the glue evenly along all surfaces. If it looks like there's not enough glue, you can always add more. Just make sure to brush it back in. Then you'll flip your pieces of wood back together, pushing them together lightly. Your lines don't have to line up perfectly, they're just a rough guide for you. Next, we'll grab our spring clamps and we'll clamp each seam to make sure that the surface is properly aligned. Any gaps in between the wood is okay, as long as it's minor, because the bar clamps will take care of that. Now we'll do that again on the other side. Now that all your edges are clamped together, you'll push the wood piece towards you and you'll tighten your bar clamps. Next, you'll take your damp rag and you'll wipe off any of the excess glue. Now that you've gotten all your glue off, you'll let this sit for about 2 hours to dry. Now we have to mark our guidelines to prep for our cutting. First, you put your square towards the edge, and you mark a line now. Then you take your tape measure, put it on the line, and measure out 18 inches. This may change depending on the size cutting board that you chose. Now, go to whatever size you desire and put a dash. Flip your square over and line it up with the dash you just made. Now take your pencil and trace a line all the way down. Now this will be what you cut out on the saw. Now that we've cut the board to length, we'll begin with our sanding process. First, we'll start with the coarser sandpaper, 150. Next, we'll move on to a finer, 180. Finally, we'll be using our finest sandpaper, 220. I'll be using an orbital sander just to save on time, but if you don't have that, you can use a sanding block with the appropriate sandpaper. When sanding, it's important to remember to always sand with the grain, not against. Now I'll switch to the 180 grit. Finally, we'll switch to the 220 grit. Now we have to sand the edges using the same 3-step process. So first we'll tilt the board onto its edge, and we'll start with our 150. Now that we have the faces and the sides sanded, it's time to round over the edges. You can do this with either a router or a sanding block and sandpaper. I'll be using a router. Now you'll repeat that same process on the other side of the board. Now we're going to sand the edges that we just routed. You'll do this by hand with a sanding block and sandpaper. First, you'll start on a slight angle and continuously change the angle of your sandpaper to smooth out the curve. Now you'll repeat that same process on all 4 sides, then you'll flip it over and do the same thing. Now that the sanding stage is complete, now we'll move on to oiling. First step is to take a clean rag and wipe off any excess dust off the faces and edges. Next, you'll take your mineral oil. I'll be using white mineral oil, which is food grade and ideal for cutting boards. You want to make sure that you get a healthy amount right in the middle of the cutting board. Now that you have your oil on there, you'll take your rag and you'll wipe it in to the edges and face. Now this part can get messy, so I recommend wearing gloves and putting down cardboard or newspaper under your cutting board. Now that it's all wiped into the face, I'll move on to the edges. Now flip your cutting board over and do the same process. You can repeat the oiling stage as many times as you need to completely seal the wood. Now that the board has sat overnight to allow the oil to completely penetrate the wood, it's time to work on the waxing. For this, you'll need a wood wax, and I'll be using walrus oil, which is specifically designed for cutting boards. And you also need a rag. You want to take your oil and get a good dollop of it. You'll need a good amount. Then you want to rub it in and completely buff it into the pores of the wood. Now when you're doing this, you'll actually be able to see the parts that you've waxed already because you'll be able to see the open grain. Now you'll continue this process all along the board and on both faces. Now that the wax is cured overnight, it's time to buff the board. So take a clean rag and firmly press and wipe off the wax. Now that the board is completely buffed, your board is finished and ready to be used.